trying to bring that about for hours. In the middle of the conversation, Bosie, having returned, burst into the room with "I want to see my cousin," and Ross rejoined Oscar. In a quarter of an hour Bosie followed him to say that he was going out with Wyndham to see someone of importance. About 5 o'clock a reporter of the Star newspaper came to see Oscar, a Mr. Marlowe, who is now editor of the Daily Mail, but again Oscar refused to see him and sent Ross. Mr. Marlowe was sympathetic and quite understood the position. He informed Ross that a tape message had come through to the paper saying that a warrant for Oscar Wilde had already been issued. Ross immediately went into the other room and told Oscar, who said nothing but went very grey in the face. A moment later Oscar asked Ross to give him the money he had got at the bank, though he had refused it several times in the course of the day. Ross gave it to him, naturally taking it for a sign that he had at length made up his mind to start, but immediately afterwards Oscar settled down in his chair and said, "I shall stay and do my sentence, whatever it is," a man evidently incapable of action. For the next hour the trio sat waiting for the blow to fall. Once or twice Oscar asked querulously where Bosie was, but no one could tell him. At 6:10 the waiter knocked at the door and Ross answered it. There were two detectives. The elder entered and said, "We have a warrant here, Mr. Wilde, for your arrest on a charge of committing indecent acts." Wilde wanted to know whether he would be given bail. The detective replied, "That is a question for the magistrate." Oscar then rose and asked, "Where shall I be taken?" "To Bow Street," was the reply. As he picked up a copy of the Yellow Book and groped for his overcoat, they all noticed that he was very drunk, though still perfectly conscious of what he was doing. He asked Ross to go to Tite Street and get him a change of clothes and bring them to Bow Street. The two detectives took him away in a four-wheeler, leaving Ross and Turner on the curb. Ross hurried to Tite Street. He found that Mrs. Oscar Wilde had gone to the house of a relative, and there was only Wilde's manservant Arthur in the house, who afterwards went out of his mind, and is still, it is said, in an asylum. He had an intense affection for Oscar. Ross found that Mrs. Oscar Wilde had locked up Oscar's bedroom and study. He burst open the bedroom door and, with the help of Arthur, packed up a change of things. He then hurried to Bow Street, where he found a howling mob shouting indecencies. He was informed by an inspector that it was impossible to see Wilde or to leave any clothes for him. Ross returned at once to Tite Street, forced open the library door and removed a certain number of letters and manuscripts of Wilde's. But unluckily he couldn't find the two manuscripts which he knew had been returned to Tite Street 2 days before, namely, a Florentine tragedy and the enlarged version of The Portrait of Mr. W.H. Ross then drove to his mother's and collapsed. Mrs. Ross insisted that he should go abroad, and in order to induce him to do it, gave £500 for Oscar's defence. Ross went to the Terminus Hotel at Calais, where Bosie Douglas joined him a little later. They both stayed there while Oscar was being tried before Mr. Justice Charles, and one day George Wyndham crossed the Channel to see Bosie Douglas. There is of course some excuse to be made for the chief actor. Oscar was physically tired and morally broken. He had pulled the fair building of reputation and success down upon his own head. and with the booing of the mob still in his ears, he could think of nothing but the lost hours when he ought to have used his money to take him beyond the reach of his pursuers. His enemies, on the other hand, had acted with the utmost promptitude. Lord Queensberry's solicitor, Mr. Charles Russell, had stated that it was not his client's intention to take the initiative in any criminal prosecution of Mr. Oscar Wilde, but on the very same morning when Wilde withdrew from the prosecution, Mr. Russell sent a letter to the Honourable Hamilton Cuff, the Director of Public Prosecutions, with a copy of all our witnesses' statements, together with a copy of the shorthand notes of the trial. The Treasury authorities were at least as eager. As soon as possible after leaving the court, Mr. C. F. Gill, Mr. Angus Lewis and Mr. Charles Russell waited on Sir John Bridge at Bow Street in his private room and obtained a warrant for the arrest of Oscar Wilde, which was executed, as we have seen, the same evening. The police showed him less than no favour. About 8 o'clock, Lord Alfred Douglas drove to Bow Street and wanted to know if Wilde could be bailed out, but was informed that his application could not be entertained. He offered to procure comforts for the prisoner. This offer also was peremptorily refused by the police inspector, just as Ross's offer of night clothes had been refused. It is a common belief that in England a man is treated as innocent until he has been proved guilty, but those who believe this pleasant fiction have never been in the hands of the English police. As soon as a man is arrested on any charge, he is at once treated as if he were a dangerous criminal. He is searched, for instance, with every circumstance of indignity. Before his conviction a man is allowed to wear his own clothes, but a change of linen or clothes is denied him, or accorded in part and grudgingly, for no earthly reason except to gratify the ill will of the jailers. The warrant on which Oscar Wilde was arrested charged him with an offence alleged to have been committed under Section 11 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. In other words, he was arrested and tried for an offence which was not punishable by law 10 years before. This act was brought in as a result of the shameful and sentimental stories, evidently for the most part manufactured, which Mr. Stead had published in the Pall Mall Gazette under the title of Modern Babylon. In order to cover and justify their profit, some of the Unker Good pressed forward this so-called legislative reform, by which it was made a criminal offence to take liberties with a girl under 13 years of age, even with her own consent. Intimacy with minors under 16 was punishable if they consented or even tempted. Mr. Labouchere, the radical member, inflamed, it is said, with the desire to make the law ridiculous, gravely proposed that the section be extended so as to apply to people of the same sex who indulged in familiarities or indecencies. The Puritan faction had no logical objection to the extension, and it became the law of the land. It was by virtue of this piece of legislative wisdom, which is without a model and without a copy in the law of any other civilized country, that Oscar Wilde was arrested and thrown into prison. His arrest was the signal for an orgy of Philistine rancour, such as even London had never known before. The Puritan middle class, which had always regarded Wilde with dislike as an artist and intellectual scoffer, a mere parasite of the aristocracy, now gave free scope to their disgust and contempt, and everyone tried to outdo his neighbour in expressions of loathing and abhorrence.